Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and today I am very pleased to present what I think is perhaps the most important video that I do every season. That, of course, being the budget deck tier list. Because, hey, we can talk about efficiently gathering resources all we want to, but then if we turn around and waste those resources on the wrong decks, we really haven't accomplished much. So let's avoid those pitfalls. But before we get into all that, I'm sure you know that the 5-year foundation set in Standard is going to change a lot of things, not just in Standard, but in particular for budget and free-to-play players. What you may not know is you can make a big impact around here by making a funding choice through our Patreon, whether you're just helping keep the lights on every month, or you're making contributions towards specific content or hardware upgrades. Just know all the Patreon funding goes back into the community. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, now right. Normally on a philosophical level, I would tell you that time is an illusion made by clock manufacturers in order to sell more clocks. But some recent changes to the flow of Standard have brought me to the conclusion that we really need to account for the temporal changes of particular sets, namely Foundations, Balloon Burrow, and Dustborn, when we're looking at assets built around those sets. In particular, Foundations is going to be around in Standard for 5+ years, raising its relative value compared to other Standard assets. Balloon Burrow and Dustborn, on the other hand, we have recently come to the realization that those are going to rotate out earlier than expected, and also lowering the relative value in a similar fashion. There are a number of factors that I consider when I'm evaluating these decks. Of course, first and foremost is how playable is the deck, because if it's not going to help you grind out those daily wins, it's probably not an ideal candidate. Secondly, how much support does this deck get from things like your starter decks, your jump-in resources, and just following the plan? Next up, a deck needs to be timely, whether that is about those resources and how likely you are to continue collecting those resources, or is the deck due for a ban, or maybe it's coming up on its rotation. And of course, formats play a factor as well. If a deck is likely to do something in a non-standard format, whether that is Alchemy, Eternal formats, or one of the Brawl bases, it's good to have flexible deck concepts. One thing you'll notice that isn't here is how fun a deck is, because fun is a very subjective thing, and I'm not here to tell you the quote-unquote right way to have fun. You're going to need to figure that out for yourself. When I'm doing evaluations, I like to use what I lovingly refer to as the Eastwood rating system, breaking your choices down into 3 easy categories: the good, the bad, and the ugly. Good decks are just that. These are what represent your best daily grinder decks, and the best places for you to invest your resources to get the optimal result to effort ratios. These decks tend to be a full standard deviation mathematically above the moving average of all the decks that we're looking at. Bad decks, on the other hand, tend to be a little more tongue-in-cheek as far as the naming convention. These decks are, in fact, centered around that moving average of all the other decks. And despite what the name might imply, these decks are still perfectly playable. I just wouldn't necessarily recommend putting a lot of resources into these decks because they're just not as well positioned as the good right now. But of course, as card pools and metas change, these could very easily shift up or down the spectrum. And finally, ugly decks are sadly just that. Although these might have been in-season darlings, they just didn't pan out the way they wanted to, and it's not really worth investing resources into these decks. But if you already have them and enjoy them, there's really no harm in playing these existing decks. They just don't seem to have a pathway to move out of this particular category, although from time to time you might see one of these move up. Now, I'd say the first thing we really need to talk about in this season is that, well, Standard has changed forever. It is the biggest Standard environment we've ever seen in the history of Magic the Gathering, going all the way back to when Type 2 was first created. And the main reason for that is Foundations itself was huge. It brought with it over 700 cards, and the majority of them are Standard legal. So it's unbelievably big when you look at Standard, and because of that, we are currently tracking more decks than I can ever remember us tracking here at the Stronghold. I've cut some, dropped some off the radar, and we're still looking at a little over 35 decks, give or take. As testing continues, some of those will drop out, others will be discovered, etc., etc., etc. But the gambit is huge, and the reality is you're not going to be able to build every deck every season, so pay attention to what's in your collection, which decks are performing the best and have the best upside potential, and really focus those resources there. And of course, that awareness is just being aware and up to date with what you have. For instance, this year we received an unprecedented 2 full sets of starter decks, one back in July and one more recently in November. 2 of those sets of decks actually hybridized together. If you just shuffle the decks together and then trim away the fat, you end up with 2 decks that are better than either of the decks that created it. The first, of course, is the Simic Ramp Land Matters deck. To be fair, it's never going to be competitive, as most ramp decks aren't, but it is a lot of fun to play, and it's a great way to get those blue-green daily quests done quickly. The other one, of course, is the Boros red-white deck, and there's just so many good cards in here, and learning how they can interact and be better together and all of that is a really invaluable tool, especially right now. Because right now, every deck in Standard is Boros. Okay, so that is a slight exaggeration, but only slightly, because we've got mono red aggro, mono white aggro, Boros aggro, mono red burn, Boros burn, the white, red, or blue tribal decks, the white base Enchantress deck that may or may not splash blue. Heck, even Soldiers from like 2 years ago is back and totally playable again, whether you're looking at the mono white version or the Azorius blue-white version. So once again, I put forth the concept that every deck is Boros right now. In fact, one key thing to remember with so many decks available to us that are pretty much in the same family of either being aggressive or direct damage decks, once you have 1, 2, maybe 3 of these decks, it's really time to stop building in this section and begin focusing on other color combinations to help with your daily quests, or other deck archetypes like maybe a control deck or a ramp or combo deck. And speaking of knowing what you have, with our recent deck infusion, we received a number of cards that fit into existing tribal strategies. Specifically, Vishino Pyromancer goes very nicely in your Outlaw Lizards deck. Fabaloom Trick, of course, goes in that tribal Fey starter deck for Dimir. And if you haven't put a Tali in your dinosaur deck just yet, you're really missing out. Now, I mentioned earlier that I dropped several decks from tracking this season, and I'm going to be perfectly honest here. I didn't take good notes while I was doing that. I just deleted things willy-nilly. But two that I know that I deleted was Simic cookies because, well, we just have free playable options for Simic, and we don't really need to develop that deck if we haven't done it already. Of course, if you already own the deck, there's no reason to not play it. It's still perfectly well positioned. The other was Mono Black Discard, because I just never could get that deck to perform consistently the way that I wanted to, and, well, Foundations really didn't do enough to support that deck and make it any more viable, so for now, I'm done with it. Maybe something will change in the future. I was asked recently why I always start in these sort of evaluation videos with the ugly decks or the ugly packs, etc., etc. And, well, frankly, it's because if you remember one thing out of this video, I want it to be what not to waste your time on. So, without further ado, let's talk about the ugly options out there for budget decks. So, right up at the top of the list, we actually have three of the brand new Foundation preview decks. The Black-Red Reckless Raid, yes, that is the confirmed name. The Black-Green Morbid Machinations, as well as the Blue-Black Undead Resurgence. All of these decks are basically punching below their weight, and they just don't have enough to offer at the moment to even warrant really upgrading these decks, unless you just happen to stumble into a really great high rarity card from opening packs or something like that. Now, don't get me wrong, in the case of the Dimir decks, there are definitely good Dimir decks out there, very meta, but in my opinion are just not really part of the budget conversation, so craft those at your own peril. When it comes to ugly tribal decks, the only one we really have to be concerned about is the Mono Black Vampires deck. Without an Innistrad set around, and its lack of support in the preview starter decks and likely the finalized versions of the starter decks, it just leaves a lot to be desired when you compare it to a very similar counterpart, the Mono Black Zombies deck, which is just so much more supported. Of course, everyone's collection is going to be a little bit different. We all out-survive the starter collections, and, well, you might grow into a vampiric direction, and, well, then it's probably worth exploring. Last and, well, arguably least, the four decks that also fall into the ugly category, mostly because of timing issues, would be the Mono Blue Jin deck, the Black Green Squirrels deck, my personal favorite, Simic Manifest Bombs, which is never going to be competitive, but hey, if you were able to build it for free, it's a perfectly fun deck and a great way to use some of your random higher rarity opens. And of course, Simic Frogs. These decks vary in playability, but right now is not an ideal time to build these decks, and, well, frankly, their time may never come again. But don't despair, there is some good news. In addition to those starter hybrid decks that we already talked about, there's a number of good tribal options, including Elves, the Cat's Life deck, as well as Rabbit tokens. We just finished talking about several Brawl decks that you could use as a non-standard palette cleanser. That would be the Elendra deck, as well as Sir Alan. And of course, there's always room for Blue-White Skies, as well as, I think the best deck right now for Mono Red is still Prowess. And of course, when it comes to those tier 2 bad but still perfectly playable decks, there is just too many to talk about. So be sure to follow the link down in the doobly-doo to the spreadsheet that covers and tracks all of them. Again, these are perfectly playable decks. They just might not be your first priority for your resources, and Matt would want you to check it out. And before we go, while every member of this community is important to me, I just wanted to take a moment and give a shout out to those patrons providing financial support and keeping the Stronghold from being a complete financial black hole. And of course, let me leave you with some suggestions for your next step here on the channel.